Well, we enter day 3 of the ongoing speakership saga. According to the Wall Street Journal, negotiations were set to continue between Kevin McCarthy and his detractors on Thursday, with some lawmakers expressing hope they could see a resolution to the speaker fight soon, both sides saying that it could take days. At this point, the discussions between McCarthy's allies and his opponents heated up after McCarthy did not reach the majority in 3 series of votes for the speaker post on Tuesday, nor another 3 on Wednesday. So we've already had 6 votes on who should be the Speaker of the House. McCarthy has come up short each and every time. It seems like there is a solid and not particularly growing chorus of people who don't want McCarthy to be Speaker, or who are at least using this vote as leverage in order to exact concessions. And this is 2 separate groups. It's about 20 Republicans right now who aren't supporting McCarthy. Probably half of them just don't want McCarthy to be Speaker. And another half of them want to exact concessions from McCarthy that would be more conservative in orientation. And there is a very large difference between these 2 groups. One of them has a strategy, one of them does not. The group that wants to exact concessions from McCarthy, this is just traditional, typical politics, right? You have leverage over McCarthy, and now you can get out of him an additional couple of seats on the Appropriations Committee, or you can get a commitment from him on not bringing to the floor omnibus packages. This stuff is good and fine and useful. And this is the sort of stuff that McCarthy has been attempting to negotiate with this group for quite a while. And there's been movement on that front. Actually, Politico was reporting as of this morning that it looks like there's a deal in the works, at least for about half of those 20 Republicans, to come on board with McCarthy, given that they are given enough concessions. So according to Politico, there are a bunch of new concessions that are on the table. Here's what's being discussed, according to one well-placed source familiar with the talks. Keep in mind, negotiations are ongoing and fluid. A 1-member motion to vacate. The GOP leader appears to have finally acquiesced to a demand to lower the threshold needed to force a vote ousting a speaker to just 1 member. While McCarthy originally indicated restoring the 1-member motion to vacate was a red line, his allies now argue there's not a huge practical difference between this and his previous offer requiring 5 members to trigger the vote. So Nancy Pelosi, upon taking office in 2018, she decided to increase the threshold for essentially a no confidence motion against the Speaker of the House. McCarthy was seeking to maintain that. Many in the House Freedom Caucus, many of McCarthy's opponents wanted to lower it back down to 1 member. McCarthy, presumably seeking to avoid an embarrassing vote every 2 months when 1 member decides that they're going to initiate some sort of vote of no confidence. He wanted to raise the threshold, but now it appears he is willing to maybe lower the threshold again. Rules Committee seats for the Freedom Caucus. McCarthy apparently is prepared to give the House Freedom Caucus a couple of seats on the powerful House Rules Committee, which oversees the amendment process on the floor, which would be good. Frankly, more amendments on the floor would be useful, considering how many bad omnibus packages come down that don't have any amendment process that is actually given to them. Now, again, a lot of this is paring away the power of the Speaker. And as we have seen already, the Republican Party has almost no power over its own membership. So the fact that the Speaker is now going to reflect the position of the Republican Party more generally is not a great shock. The Speaker of the House used to be able to wield all sorts of power over his membership. Nancy Pelosi was actually amazingly good at wielding power over her membership because mainly she was an incredible fundraiser. And this meant that she could either withdraw money from particular candidates or give money to particular candidates. She would withdraw committee assignments, switch committee assignments, use whatever power was available in order to cudgel everybody into line. Republicans traditionally are not as good at this, and it certainly has been true since the end of the Gingrich era. McCarthy now wants to give, apparently he's willing to give the House Freedom Caucus a couple of seats on the House Rules Committee. There are also talks about giving a 3rd seat to a conservative close to the Freedom Caucus, but not in it, somebody like Representative Thomas Massie of Kentucky. Apparently, there is a struggle right now between the Freedom Caucus and McCarthy. McCarthy saying, I want to pick those members, and the Freedom Caucus saying, we want to pick those members. They also want to vote on term limits. There's a key demand from Representative Ralph Norman, who's proposed a constitutional amendment limiting lawmakers to 3 terms in the House. Now, again, it would take an actual constitutional amendment in all likelihood for term limits to become the law of the land, and it's going nowhere in the Senate. So McCarthy can easily say, fine, we'll have a vote on it, and then the vote just goes dead in the Senate. And again, none of that would be a giant shock. The big one, and this is the big positive one, would be a major change to the appropriations process. Fears of another $1 trillion+ omnibus spending bill have been the major driver of the conservative backlash to McCarthy. The brewing deal includes a promise for standalone votes on each of the 12 yearly appropriations bills, which would be considered under what is known as an open rule, which would allow floor amendments to be offered by any lawmaker. Conservatives also want a concession to carve out earmarks included in those packages for separate votes, although it's unclear if they'd be voted on as one package or separately. Now, again, all this is going to make legislation very, very unworkable. It's going to be very unwieldy. I don't have a problem with it being unworkable and unwieldy. There's going to come a point where McCarthy is going to have to pass some of these votes. And what's likely to happen in that case is that, let's say that they move forward with these appropriations bills and all the Democrats vote against the appropriations bills and they carve off another 15, 20 Republicans who won't vote for the appropriations bills. And suddenly we're in the position of a government shutdown. McCarthy doesn't want to preside over another government shutdown. You'll get another bipartisan deal. You may end up back where you started, but at least people will have had their say, which I'm not opposed to in any way, shape, or form. There's one more big concession that apparently is coming from the Congressional Leadership Fund. The McCarthy-aligned Congressional Leadership Fund reached a deal with the Conservative Club for Growth, which had initially signaled opposition to Speaker McCarthy to stay out of open House primaries for safe Republican seats. So in the past, the Congressional Leadership Fund had poured in millions of dollars to back more establishment candidates against the Club for Growth, which was backing a lot of insurgent Tea Party-esque candidates. And now the Congressional Leadership Fund is committing to staying out of open primaries in very solidly held conservative seats. So is that going to land the plane? The problem is nobody really knows. This is the big issue. Because again, you have two groups here who are negotiating, and they're sort of pretending to be one group for purposes of solidarity, but it really is two groups. Right? Group one are the people who are attempting to exact concessions like the ones we just mentioned, which are good and useful, and that, again, is normal congressional bargaining and parlaying. And the other is people who just say, never McCarthy, never McCarthy, never McCarthy, and no matter what the concessions are. And there, I have serious questions about the strategy, as we'll get to in just one moment. So, first of all, the falsehood that McCarthy has made no concessions to this group already is not true. I mean, it's just not real. Representative Warren Davidson, Republican of Ohio, listed yesterday a bunch of the concessions McCarthy had already made to the people who are not interested in voting for him at this time.
Following the election, Kevin McCarthy engaged in that negotiation. He led the conference to adopt substantive reforms that will make our majority more effective. Let me list some of them. Scott Perry's proposal for additional conference meetings ahead of key votes. Bob Good's proposal on standalone appropriations bills. Andy Biggs' proposal limiting suspension waivers from committees. Chip Roy's proposal to make co-sponsored amendments in order. Affirm 72-hour publication of bills before calling for a recorded vote. An end to proxy voting.
So these are all concessions that McCarthy made, and the list goes on and on and on right here. So Representative Roy was asked last night by Bret Baier what he's hoping to achieve, and he says many of these concessions. And then he's asked the question by Bret Baier of Fox News, so if you get these concessions, will you and this group then vote for McCarthy? And the problem for Chip Roy is he's kind of negotiating on behalf of people who disagree with him. Many of them don't actually just want the concessions. They just don't want McCarthy. And herein lies the problem for McCarthy. He's negotiating with one group that's reasonable and wants concessions, and another group that just doesn't want McCarthy. The big concession is McCarthy steps aside. So how exactly is he supposed to negotiate all of that? And again, this is not coming from a place of animus against any of these Congress people. I know people in all three of these groups. I know people who are very strongly in support of McCarthy. I know people who are in the Chip Roy group, and I've been talking with them. I know people who are in the anti-McCarthy group, and I've been talking with some of them as well. So this notion that this is about animus against any one of these groups is wrong. I just think that two of these groups have a strategy, and one of these groups does not. The problem, of course, is that if you have enough people who don't have a strategy, and their strategy is essentially loud noises, this could force a very, very dangerous floor vote on the speakership law, which I'll explain in just a second. Here's Chip Roy explaining what he wants, and Bret Baier saying, so if you get what you want, do you have the votes? And Chip Roy being like, I don't know.
We're having a conversation tonight. We're going to keep talking about it. We want Rules Committee changes. We want to protect the rules that we've already been able to advance. We want to make sure we have spending restraint like the cut, cap, and balance from a decade ago. We're having those conversations as we speak, but we're not going to relent unless we can actually do our job and stop this town, this broken town, from rolling over the American people. Yeah. That's my job.
And if Kevin McCarthy says, you know what, I'll give you everything you want, what will you say?
Well, give me everything I want, right? I mean, I've got to be able to go to the American people. But
what you want is not Kevin McCarthy.
But I didn't say that. If I get everything that I want, that's great. But we got to get to 218. So right now in the room, Brett, it's not just Chip Roy.
Okay, that's the point. And so Chip Roy is being reasonable. It's a lot of the other people who are out there who are not particularly being reasonable at this point. By the way, we should mention at this point, it's not like Kevin McCarthy is a big lib inside the Republican caucus. Kevin McCarthy's Heritage Action score is 88%. Steve Scalise's is 90%. People are opposing Steve Scalise as a possible replacement. 88% makes you one of the more conservative members of the Republican House of Representatives. He has like an 86% score from the American Conservative Union. This isn't a person who's like wildly liberal on the far left wing of the Republican Party. The big rip on Kevin McCarthy is that he's a wheeler and a dealer. But in a moment where the party essentially exerts no influence over an entire cadre of its own members, you kind of have to be a wheeler and dealer to get there. So people are saying, well, why is McCarthy even bringing his own speakership up for a vote if he doesn't have the votes? Let me remind you, there is not a single Republican Speaker of the House candidate who's gotten a unanimous vote for their candidacy since John Boehner in January of 2011. It has been 11 years since then. John Boehner in 2013, when he was up for re-election for Speaker of the House, 12 Republicans defected against him. Right now, you have about 20 Republicans who are defecting against McCarthy. About 10 of those seem to be about solid defections. 8 to 10 of those are solid defections, maybe as small as 5. But the majority is so small at 222, and you have to get to 218, that 5 members of the House can stand against the other 217 members of the Republican caucus and then demand that the candidate with 217 votes step aside in favor of an unnamed candidate who's not even declared as of yet. And if the 5 had another candidate they were putting up there who I thought was stronger and better and more likely to actually get to 218, then okay, fine. I'd be all in favor. That's fine. I'm always up for a better candidate. But so far, nothing remotely like that has been presented. Alrighty, guys, the rest of the show is continuing right now. You're not going to want to miss it. We'll be getting into Walgreens now distributing the abortion pill. Plus, we have on an economist to discuss the problems with the interest rate in the United States and why stagflation looks like our future. If you're not a member, become a member. Use code Shapiro at checkout for 2 months free on all annual plans. Great deal. Click the link in the description and join us.